He walked into the restaurant like a ghost from another life, mud on the cuffs of a jacket that had seen too many winters, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and a photo folded inside his hand as if it were the only thing keeping him breathing. The dining room glittered with chandeliers and the soft clink of forks. Waiters in crisp shirts moved like clockwork. At the center table, under the light that made Jules sing, a woman wore a ring that had a small speech of its own. It flashed when she tipped her wine glass. It caught every eye. He pointed. The room froze. 100 forks hung in midair. The man's finger trembled, and his voice came out thin but steady. "That ring, my mother used to wear it." It was a small sentence. It was the kind of sentence that unravels entire lives. Security rose like a second tide. Heads turned. The billionaire at the table, Carla Ribeiro, stared at the man as if she'd seen a ghost. Her fork clinked against the plate and went unheeded. She was used to people staring. She was not used to being stopped mid-breath by a claim that landed like a stone on polished marble. "Sir, you can't," a guard started. Carla put up a hand. There was something in the homeless man's eyes she recognized before she knew why. She saw the ring again, close up in her mind, an old family pattern, an unusual crescent of tiny stones around a central opal that seemed to hold light itself. She remembered her mother's voice telling a story about it, and she realized with a rising hollowness that the ring was the one they thought lost, with a person she had loved and then lost. "Wait," she said, and the room leaned in, because even billionaires can sound small when something large lurches inside them. "Show me what you have." He unfolded the photograph, with fingers that had grown careful from years of protecting fragile things. The picture was worn at the edges, the gloss gone like a memory that had been cried. It showed a woman with the same slant to her nose as Carla's, the same stubborn chin, but softer, younger. Milena. The ring was on her hand, sitting in a pose that hurt like proof. For a moment there was no sound but the sudden forgetting of dinner. If you love true reunions like this, subscribe for more stories like it. Verification was not instant. It never is. There were no police reports waved in the air, no DNA tests performed in 5 minutes on a restaurant napkin. What happened, what mattered, was honest and human. The photograph, the ring's pattern seen in the worn metal, a remark about the scar behind the left ear that the man mentioned by accident, something Milena had once said only to family. Carla's eyes filled. Rodrigo, her son, who had been leaning forward with his glass, paled. "Where did you get this?" she asked the man, voice small. "From my mother," he said. "She gave it to me. She said to keep it if anything happened. She said to find her if I could." His hands shook around the photograph, as if it might burn.
Security relaxed a notch, but stayed close. A dozen people photographed the moment with phones, not realizing that some things recorded on a screen can never capture the weight of a name returned aloud. Carla slid from her chair and, with a movement that had nothing to do with her usual life, walked over to him. She crouched so they were nearly eye to eye, and the ring caught the chandelier light again, like an answering bell. "You're sure?" she asked. He nodded. "I remember the sound it made when she took it off, like a little bell. She said not to sell it. She said some people would look for it, but not all of them are your people." That phrase, "not all of them are your people," cut through the hush in a way that made Carla breathe. She asked him to come with her, quietly, without the cameras, without the pitying eyes. There was a car waiting, and Rodrigo spoke into his phone in a voice that tried to be steady. The city spread out around them, neon and rain-slick pavement giving way to narrower streets, the smell of frying food and laundry lines. The contrast, crystal chandeliers to flickering street lamps, made the air feel thin and sharp. They drove until the buildings got smaller, and the hands of the city read like a different map. Carla sat beside the man whose name she learned was Marco. She asked simple questions. "Where does your mother live? When did you last see her?" He answered with fragments that stitched into a picture, a promise of protection, a night when people came who were not supposed to be there, a choice made to disappear, and then years of waiting. At the front step of a low apartment building, the door opened like a secret admitted. The hall smelled of coffee and bleach and the kind of quiet that lives where money and fame do not walk. A woman on the threshold, older, thinner in the face, but unmistakable, stared at Carla until her knees nearly gave out. Milena. It was not cinematic in the way a movie arranges tragedies for maximum release. It was messy and loud. Milena's hand flew to her mouth as if to check whether the world still had its teeth. Marco ran forward and flung himself into an embrace that had been rehearsed in his chest for years. Carla stood still, a figure who had once been everything, and now felt the strange lightness of someone wanting to be forgiven and fearing she could not be. There was disbelief that tasted like air swallowed too fast. "This can't be real," Rodrigo whispered. "This is real," Milena said, though her voice trembled. "I left to keep you safe." The conversation that followed was private and jagged. They did not sit on the floor and sing Kumbaya. They argued about the choices made in the dark. Milena explained, in a voice that did not beg for absolution, but did seek to be heard, that there have been threats, vague men who knocked too late, a presence that made doors feel unsafe.
She had been offered something like a poisoned bargain. Stay away, disappear, live under the radar, and the one she loved would be left alone. She chose to step into the shadow. Guilt moved through the room like a winter draft. Carla listened and felt the years she had been absent press against her chest. She had sheltered her family in ways that money could make possible. She had also, in the thick sleep of denial, never quite noticed how a threat could knot a brave person into silence. She apologized, an apology that tasted of things she might have said too late. Milena did not collapse into forgiveness. She set boundaries. "You can help," Milena said softly, "but not by fixing everything today. I will not be put on display and called a miracle. I will not lose my voice again." Carla understood the need for conditions. She agreed to rules that were small and precise. No media circus, no public statements without consent, honest time for trust to grow, and space for Milena and Marco to choose how to re-enter what had been taken. It was not grand in its absolution. It was careful, patient, and tethered to dignity. Carla pledged resources, housing, counseling, legal safety measures to the extent she could arrange, and more importantly, she pledged a daily willingness to listen. There were setbacks. There were nights when Marco could not sleep without the phantom image of a slammed door, and days when people on the street recognized him and spat assumptions that bit into his confidence. There were moments of anger from Rodrigo, who had his own fears, of betrayal, of being judged for the family's blind spots. Each friction burned, then, slowly, began to heal as the family did the hard work of showing up. The transformation was not a single page in a script. It was a collection of small scenes stitched together by time. Carla took Milena to a small clinic for a medical check and a counselor who knew how to hold trauma without turning it into spectacle. Milena, began at her own pace to meet an old friend for a coffee. Marco found a tiny workshop through a foundation Carla quietly funded. He learned to repair shoes and later small appliances. The dignity of work brought back to him a steady breath. Months passed. The ring stayed with Carla for a while, sealed in a velvet box. Sometimes she took it out and turned it in her fingers, remembering how a simple piece of metal had become a compass. Other times she placed it on Milena's hand during a quiet dinner and watched the way the light settled differently, without the press of proof, simply as an object among people who were finding their way back to one another. Out of the reunion, something else grew. A desire in Carla not merely to patch one broken corner of the city with money, but to build something that acknowledged how easy it is for a person to slip into the margins. She began talking with advisors and with Milena, who insisted on practical honesty. They founded a small nonprofit, not a billboard charity with grand photos, but a program modeled to respect privacy and provide real pathways, transitional housing, job training, counseling, and legal assistance for people who'd been forced into the shadows by threats or poverty. They named a program after the ring, quietly, to honor the way small objects can hold large histories. Marco's life changed gradually. A roof over his head did not erase the memories of concrete and nights spent listening for footsteps, but it gave him a place to leave his bag and a mirror that did not accuse. He enrolled in a course at the nonprofit that taught basic carpentry. He learned to take apart and reassemble a radio. He learned to trust a schedule that included sleep. He and Milena talked often, sometimes about the old days, sometimes about nothing important at all, how the view from the fourth-floor landing smelled different in summer. Each ordinary conversation was a stitch. There were public moments too, carefully chosen. An anniversary dinner marked the founding of the nonprofit. The guest list was small, close friends, a few neighbors, and staff who had worked with the participants for months. The cameras were kept off. A cake was cut. Marco made a short, halting speech. No rehearsed platitudes, just truth. "I used to think no one would stop to see me," he said. "I thought I'd always be a shadow." He looked at Milena and Carla. "But I was seen," he added, voice steady. "And that made me want to be better." Not perfect, not a wipe-clean redemption. There were relapses, anger flares, nights when Marco wanted to run away into the anonymity of the streets that had once been his refuge. But the people around him learned to hold with patience rather than astonishment. They learned that love is not a single great act, but 1,000 small ones: visits, a shared cup of tea, a neighbor offering an extra blanket. Years, months that felt like years, later, the nonprofit hosted an event for job placements. There were moments of ceremony, a key handed to a man who had found a small apartment, envelopes with schedules, a certificate for Marco after finishing a mechanics course. Milena baked a modest cake. Carla stood at the back and watched the room fill with people who no longer felt like a problem to be solved, but like citizens being offered a hand. In a quiet moment, Marco walked outside and felt for the first time in a long time a kind of ordinary peace. He touched the ring that Milena had placed in his pocket earlier that day, a small gesture that meant they were not erasing what had been, but were carrying it forward. The ring was not the cause of everything. It was the crooked breadcrumb that led them back to each other. The real work was the choice to answer the breadcrumb, to open a door, to stop pretending that a photograph could replace time.
The story that began with a finger pointing in a fancy restaurant ended not with a miracle, but with the steady unfolding of humanity. Carla learned a lesson she could not have bought, that a family's safety is not simply a matter of money, but of presence. Milena reclaimed a life that had been lived in private and chose, cautiously, to lean into community. Marco built a life from small, steady actions, taught by hands that were willing to give him work and by ears willing to listen. They never promised that everything would be perfect. They never claimed that a single foundation could erase the systemic failures that push people to the margins. But they did what people can do. They created structures that honored dignity, gave real support, and opened channels for people to choose a different path. The nonprofit they started served people who had been overlooked in the bright city, people with stories that had not fit the headlines. It offered counselors who respected privacy and trainers who taught skills that led to real paychecks. It did not pretend to fix everything. It worked where it could. Sometimes the public still asked questions. Reporters tried to turn the reunion into a spectacle. Carla had learned to guard against that. Milena refused to be a headline. Marco declined to be anyone's poster child. They set boundaries and made them clear. The ring, once a flash of jewelry and proof, became a symbol, not of pity, not of simple restoration, but of a trace that connected people across a lifetime of choices and sacrifices. At a small celebration for the nonprofit's 5th year, Milena stood and read a short note she had written. It was not a long speech. It did not lay blame or make grand promises. She spoke about courage, about the courage to leave and the courage to come back. She spoke about hearing the truth from someone who had nothing to gain. She spoke about how small things, a ring, a photo, a name spoken aloud, had threaded them back to each other. "We were afraid," she said simply. "But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to speak, to listen, and to act." Carla caught Marco's eye across the room. He smiled, a small, honest thing. The light fell on the ring on Milena's hand and did not seem to judge. The room applauded softly, not for a tidy ending, but for the ongoing patience of lives remaking themselves. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in it that mattered, leave a like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Tell us where you're watching from, or share a story of a small act that changed a life. We read everyone. In the end, the lesson was quietly radical. Small truths, spoken aloud, have power. A ring that once seemed like a mere object became a catalyst because someone had the courage to point, because someone else had the humility to listen.
The real shock was not that a homeless man recognized a piece of jewelry. The real shock was the reminder that people carry histories in pockets and photographs, and that sometimes when we answer, we help rebuild more than a single life. We help remind a city that it contains lives worth tending.